So a lot of times my job is to help them think through the vision of what story they're trying to tell. So if we can't afford to do that because we're not Taylor Swift, what about that gesture means something to the storytelling? I feel like it's just this thing of like, if you're management, one of the first things you do is to listen, do a listening tour, right? You don't just like decide to change everything, because a big part of the listening is to see why people are upset and what change they want, or what things they think are really good that you want to keep. It was very lucky to fall into production management quite early in my life. So I think by 23, I was already production managing for one of the biggest theater companies in Singapore. And I think the thing about production management is just that it's never the same. And you're always having to solve something that's really fascinating and interesting. That's like a very different puzzle.
Welcome to the Theatre Adelaide podcast. Today we're talking to Audrey Hoo.
A lifelong arts maker, Audrey Hoo is the director of production of Tony Award-winning Berkeley Repertory Theatre in Berkeley, California. Originally from Singapore, Audrey ventured to the United States to seek new experiences. Most recently, she has worked at the American Conservatory Theatre, Jolla Playhouse, and the Brooklyn Academy of Music. She's had the pleasure of working with artists across all performing arts genres such as Tony Taccone, Chay Yew, Christopher Ashley, William Kentridge, Alex Timbers, Catherine Martin, Sam Mendes, Paul Simon, Laurie Anderson, John Turturro, and Elaine Stritch. Outside work, Audrey strives to be her best self, always pushing to learn new skills. Her main loves include martial arts, hiking, West Coast swing, and country two-step dances. Audrey holds an M.F.A. in technical direction from the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. Welcome to the show, Audrey.
Yay, that's me. Hi. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Great. Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
So tell us, we just spoke before offline. You said you've been in the States for 20 years. You started in Singapore. What was your pathway into the arts, and what took you to America?
Yeah, so really I started in theater by accident, as a lot of us do. In Singapore, we followed a British system, so that's more like A-levels, O-levels, GCE exams, and in between the A-levels, before you get to college, there was like a 3-month break. And in that break, one of my friends was working for the box office of Theatre Works in Singapore, and she called to say, hey, do you want to come earn some money and help us roll some fabric? And it turned out to be a really epic, immersive, site-specific theater piece that was on a beautiful hill called Fort Canning, about the Japanese comfort women in World War II, called Broken Birds. And who's anybody in the Singapore theater art scene was in this play. And here I was, like little 17-year-old, pretty sheltered, conservative life. And for the first time I met, people that was so different than who I was. And there was something beautiful and also kind of like, wow, I found my people. I can get paid doing this like strange thing. So I was stage crew for that show. In Singapore, we're really subjected to the outdoor elements. So there was a lot of rain, really hot sun. I remember a ton of ants biting us. That was one of my jobs, was to kind of try to identify the like mounds of ants so that the performers won't roll into it. So at that point, I didn't do good enough to get into college, but I didn't do bad enough to go back to the school to retake that year. So I had to do it by myself. But I was very then singularly focused on going to college for theater because I had such a positive experience. And that, I would say, transformative. I wasn't out at that time, and I don't think I understood what it meant to be different. But being around the people in theater kind of gave me a glimpse of how life could be different. And I think that's why I really gravitate towards it, that we tell compelling stories, that we're surrounded by such amazing people. Yeah, so that was really why I kind of fell into it. Yeah, so I didn't mean to come to the US really. I graduated from National University of Singapore. I majored in theater studies. I stayed in theater in Singapore. I worked in the general management department at Theater Works, and I became the production manager of the Necessary Stage and moved to the Esplanade Theater, which is a huge arts venue in Singapore. And I decided that it was time to really focus on a technical skill. Unfortunately, most of the other countries only offered a second bachelor's, and I didn't want to waste my energy and time to get a second BA. The only country that offers an M.F.A. was the United States. So that was really grudgingly, I came to the US. And of all the schools I researched, I spent a good year and a half researching. I visited a couple schools. At the time, the University of North Carolina was called NCSA, and the ratio of teachers to students and the facilities and the cost of tuition were the three big factors of why I chose it. And I ended up coming to the US almost exactly 20 years ago in September. And the doors kept opening. I think I didn't mean to stay in the US, but again, like, I'm a firm believer that if the door opens, you're meant to stay and you're meant to go on. So I sort of ended up staying, and, time just flew right by. Yeah.
I don't think up to today there's many other or any other programs for technical direction outside of the United States. I don't know if you know any.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the other thing I did want to talk a little bit about. Like, theater around the world is so different, and the way in which technical fields divide management and labor, it's so different, right? Like, so the US is very different than Singapore. I think Singapore is a lot more focused on the British and Australian systems. I find that people are a lot more well-rounded. You're expected to have a kind of good base of everything: scenery, lighting, video, sound, at least. And then, there's more specialties and costumes. Whereas I think the US model kind of moved towards deep diving into a really special skill set. When I was in college, there were maybe 30 of us in our class, and only, I would say, maybe 6 or 7 remained in theater. Everybody else kind of went into a different profession, like teaching. And a handful of us remained friends, and we sort of made a pact that we would go to different countries and different schools to collect knowledge about how things get done, and then go back to Singapore. But a few of us didn't actually go back. So one friend went to Hong Kong to do lighting design. One friend came to Yale to get her M.F.A. in stage management. I think one went to Cal Arts. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to pick North Carolina. And I'm going to pick technical direction, which it's in itself is not a career that's available in Singapore, right? Like, there's no such thing as a technical director. Technical managers mean very different things in a different country. So it's quite interesting, because we just also worked with John Tiffany and Stephen Hoggett, the team that created the Harry Potter shows on Broadway. They came to us at Berkeley Rep so that we could remount Let the Right One In, which was a show right before Harry Potter. And the team from National Theatre of Scotland had asked, so what do you actually do, Audrey, as the production manager of Berkeley Rep? Because it's very confusing to us in Scotland, because this is what production management means in Scotland. So that was quite fun to talk a little bit about, like, okay, here are the technical directors. They talk about engineering of physical production, which is, in the UK model, I find compressed into the kind of production supervisor, production manager, technical supervisor, whatever you call them. There's no distinct separation of that role. So
I think that's such a good point, because, I often I hire people from all around the world, and I really have to be very specific about the job description, because,
yeah,
like you just said, the job role that they think they're applying for means different means something different to many people. How do you think that manifests for people that get educated in the States versus people that are not? And how does that manifest in the real world when, like you said, yeah, maybe some confusion, but what are the pros and cons of what you would see as an American training when it comes to those very specific roles?
It's quite interesting. I mean, it really depends on who you're working with. Obviously the model in America works for America. So, for example, I actually think the British stage management system makes a lot more sense, where there's a deputy stage manager that specifically calls the show, and what you call the head of stage management. Here, the PSM runs the department, kind of has holistic oversight, and has to also focus on calling cues, which seems to be an enormous amount of work. It's just too much. And I think that in the British model, the DSM really focuses on just calling, and then there's somebody that has oversight. So that makes some sense. So that to me is a system that works a little bit better. But the American system is what the American system is. So pros and cons, I think that I find that the American industry pays the best. It recognizes talent. There's definitely a conversation about wages and a recognition of skill set, a recognition of the depth of skills and experience that you need to succeed. And at some level, I miss the kind of the generalist. I think when I find technicians that come from the UK or Australia, they know a lot about everything. And so when I have a small group of technical people, it's good that everybody knows everything. I think, at least in the case of Singapore, still like the performing arts wages are quite behind. And there's really still no public recognition of the importance of arts. It's still very kind of conservative in the Asian mindset of like, you should grow up to be a doctor, an accountant, or an engineer. And so I wish that mindset would change, but like, I think what we are in performing arts is just a reflection of what the society is set up to be and how it's, so I think the United States found itself going down this road because of the Ford car factory, the kind of idea of specialization of skills, right? Like, so this idea of if you take it apart and everybody specializes on a little thing, that kind of spread across every single industry, including the performing arts. I do wish that a lot more people would understand more about other segments of the industry. I find them to be sometimes a little bit stuck in their rabbit hole. So.
And so what would you say in this description of tasks, of differentiation of the tasks? What's the role of the director of production, the production manager? Like at the end of the day, I feel like they all are the same words, just put on different ways and kind of mean the same and are not the same.
Yeah, that's a funny question. So I did ask for my title to change the director of production, but like truly, I do not care. I still do the same things as when I was called the production manager. Before I left the American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco, I advocated for my position to be renamed director of production in recognition of matching the other fields of marketing and development, because in those departments, there's a director of development, which is the fundraising component. And then you have a lot of managers. So what production manager doesn't always capture is that you're the head of the department. So, but there are some companies now that have elevated everybody. So there is a director of production, and then there's several production managers and several associate production managers or coordinators or supervisors, right? I mean, the long and short of, I think, all of our jobs is that we are project managers. We manage budgets, schedules, people. If you're just a production manager, to me, I have kind of oversight of all of the departments. But really all of those, the costume shop director, the technical director, the prop supervisor, they are all kind of doing the same things I am, just with more special skill sets, right? They're really deciding how props get built. How do you kind of research and develop a special effect and execute it? And as the production manager, I make sure that on the big scale, that all departments are playing nicely together, that we're moving towards the goal together, and that we're collaborating together. So that's one set of it. So to me, it's like if I transfer that to a non-theatrical setting, I'm really oversight of fabrication and manufacturing. But then there's also the kind of the other side, which is managing the artist. So creative teams, like if a director wants to, I like to use this analogy of fly a cow across the theater and have it explode with glitter, and we can't afford it, right? Like, so a lot of times my job is to help them think through the vision of what story they're trying to tell. So if we can't afford to do that because we're not Taylor Swift, what about that gesture means something to the storytelling, so that I can get it down to distill it to what are you actually going after? So at Berkeley Rep, we do a lot of new work, and we have a lot of writers who are still with us in the work, so we can be in conversation about what that looks like. So that's part of it, and that's part of it. And then the other part of it is the kind of being open to, so I'm not front facing. I think of marketing and development as a lot of like client, like patron services, like taking care of the people that come to watch the arts. But I do think of production as a very kind of, why do we exist? We exist in service of telling a story, but if nobody is there to listen to the story, then why do we actually do what we do? So I think that's also a really important component of what we do. And it's always important to tell the story of, like, people don't understand like how backdrops are being painted, right? Like, how do you get the texture on the scenery that's all fake? But people, if you don't tell those stories, I don't think that patrons or people that watch the arts really understand how much craft goes into it. So that's kind of the third part of it. So I don't know. I think that my job as a production manager in Singapore was solving problems. I think my job here is also solving problems. It's like being an advocate and to solve problems, given the kind of sandbox. And it's the same, but it's different. So, yeah. I don't
That's
know if I
super
answered your
interesting.
question.
No, I think you did. I think you did. But it led me to think, because there's been a lot in the media right now about the crisis that American theatre is in terms of attendance and budgets and things like that. And given you are one of those people, what is happening over there in your words? And are budgets getting smaller? Is it getting harder? How are you guys doing there?
And now a note from our sponsor. The Theatre Art Live podcast is proud to be sponsored by Clearcom. Clearcom is the leader in voice communications for theatre and the performing arts. Call your cues with the simplicity and elegance of Clearcom Intercom solutions. You can find them at clearcom.com. Go check them out.
Yeah. It's not a good time in the performing arts industry in the US. I think that it's always been a struggle. We've always survived. That is all true. I think that what we saw from the pandemic was catastrophic. I think the pandemic itself kind of sped up the theaters that were healthy kind of will survive, might have to scale down, might have to figure out some stuff. The theaters that were not healthy, the pandemic kind of I think it showed us which ones were not going to survive, right? Because it was one, I mean, like, that's the really interesting thing. It's like one massive incident can just end a theater's lifespan. But it wasn't just one. I think there was several crises. I think climate change, the issue was smoke. So outdoor theaters, if you haven't read or know what's happening with like OSF, they lost, it's first of all, it's the pandemic, and then they had smoke, and then the fires actually came really close to the actual facility. I mean, like, that's real. And that every time you lose a performance, it's a lot of money. And then once you kind of lose confidence in folks wanting to spend ticket money. So if you spent money for Taylor Swift concert and then like the smoke came and then you couldn't have it, I mean, like, why would you spend your money next year? I don't think there's a lot of confidence that way. So that's one example. I think that most of the non-for-profits had something called the Small Venue Operating Grant, which is something that the government gave to kind of float companies called SVOG. So a lot of us got a huge influx of money, but then we already laid off like a lot of personnel. So for the first time in a long time, a lot of theater companies ended the year in the black. They were above the line because that was kind of income. So then people started buying stuff because I think there was a lot of criteria about how that grant could be used. But when the grant went away, I think people realized a couple things. So inflation is happening. Where I live in the Bay Area, inflation is insane. The cost of living is unbelievably high. A sheet of plywood, like at some point, a stick of steel, a sheet of plywood almost quadrupled in price overnight. Our budgets weren't going any higher, but without steel and wood, we have to buy some of these things. And so that's really impacting us. But the other thing that inflation, I think, is doing is that people have a lot less disposable income. So they're not going to want to spend it on a theater ticket if they can spend it on a, $15 membership for Netflix. So I think there's like 3 or 4 things happening at the same time. So cost of living is coming up. People are agitating to get paid more, and they should be paid more. So the cost of doing business is just increasing, right? And less people are coming back. So we are seeing donors also choose other kind of things to spend their money on, like climate change, politics. So I'm not quite sure what to make of it. I feel like the situation in Singapore is so dependent on government funding. I think the UK as well, a lot of my UK theater friends really kind of suffered through the pandemic, and even post-pandemic, it looks very thinly staffed. So, I don't know that they're back to what it was either. I think they're also seeing lack of kind of response. So I think it's not just the US. Yeah. And I think that as soon as the first theater company said, let's take a break, or let's pause and not do a show this season, I think that kind of it almost allowed the other boards to say, oh, wow, that's an option. So then if one announced, then several started announcing all at once. Yeah.
Who was the first that did that? Do you know?
It kind of slowly rolled. So in the Bay Area itself, I think Cal Shakes might have been the first one to say, we're going to not produce, we're going to just present. And then Bay Area Children's Theater just filed for bankruptcy pretty quickly, which was very sad. So, yeah.
Yeah. I do think it is a global situation. Obviously there's American specifics with regards to that, but generally inflation and the fact that a lot of people left the industry in the pandemic, and also they're just quite cautious about spending a lot of money on new shows because they don't know if it's going to work or not. So how often do you get back to Singapore, or are in touch with Singapore in the industry there, and your friends in that region?
I try and go back once a year because my mom still lives there. So I try and see friends who still work there. So yeah, it's quite nice to be in touch. And, I still talk to some friends who work at the Esplanade. A lot of us stay in touch online. Yeah. I sort of like that part of theater and performing arts. It's like once you meet a group of artists or technicians. So when I worked at Brooklyn Academy of Music, we were really into international shows, and I still keep in touch with a lot of people. So, yeah.
Tell us more about that experience, because you spent there a good 7 years, right? That was your first
about 7
job.
years. Yeah, it was fun. I think the thing with BAM was one of the people that suffered. I think it was on New York Times that they did a huge cutback. So that was really sad. I think it's going through a bit of a struggle right now. So I think when I was there, there was one scary recession moment, but otherwise I felt, I always am grateful for my time there. I feel like it was we did a lot of exciting things, including a 3-year collaboration with the Old Vic Theatre in London. We did something called the Bridge Project, which was trying to strive to be equally 50% US and 50% UK in all aspects. So designers, stage management, cast, and that was really that was a lot of work, and it was pretty stressful, but I really enjoyed it. And then it would tour. So it would either start at BAM, tour the world, and end up at the Old Vic, or start at the Old Vic, tour the world, and end up at BAM. So I think that really kept the kind of flame alive for doing live theater for me. But otherwise, the other thing I really loved about BAM was I got to do all this live music. So I've always been a fan of live music, but I never always got a chance to work on a music festival or with like rock and roll people. So it really taught me that the pace of, so even though I do the same things as a production manager, the timing and the pace of shows are very different. Where in theater, you have to be very scheduled and planned out. In rock and roll, you just wait till the week before. I was very anxious all the time. I was like, why can't people just draw their stage plot and tell me what they're doing? And my friends that come from the rock and roll world, they're like, oh no, Audrey.
That's not happening.
That's not the way it works. You roughly know it. Yeah, so they definitely wait till very, very late, and then they have like a sketch of what they want to do, but they won't decide until like closer. So it was kind of fun to just be able to work with like dance, music, straight up classical music to opera to theater to circus folks. Very crazy, very risk taking. And everybody has different pace of work. And people that come from different countries that are certain stereotypes that are true to the stereotype. I was very shocked. I felt like the Belgium team, like the team from, I can't remember, they were so precise. I was like shocked. They came down to the like nth of a centimeter and they were like exactly that. I'm like, wow, you're on it. And there's some folks that were just like, there was one team that sent us a sea container full of parts. I just think it was just sticks of steel with like drilled out holes, and they didn't label anything. Yeah, it was. Yeah. So we like stood there and we looked at it for a second and we're like, what is this? They were like, oh, we had extra parts. So we just put everything in and then we'll see what we need. And we were like saying that going, what? So it's like having the ability to, I think, work with different artists. So we were also a local IATSE for quite structured, very structured in meal breaks. And, so it was very careful with the budget and time. So it's like, how do you make international artists fit into that very strict timeline? That was quite difficult. That was actually, it's quite challenging. And some countries were really on top of it. And some countries that were really like laid back, they did not understand why we pushed them so hard. Yeah, it's really.
There is a reputation about the IATSE structure globally. I think it was like, oh, if it's an IATSE venue, gosh, it comes with all of those rules. How did you deal with that with your international clients? How did you sort of coach them through that? Those, I wouldn't want to say restrictions, but parameters, because they're different parameters than going there elsewhere.
I mean, I think I just try and like tell them like, hey, you're a visitor in our home and this is the house rules. So please be respectful. It's not personal. The guys that work on the shows work at a very high level. They're really good technicians and they're structured this way so that they get fair breaks. And if you don't respect them, like we go over budget and then you won't be invited back if you keep doing it like knowingly, right? Like, so can you please just help us? And so it depends. A lot of the companies that really, it was very difficult to manage. I would give them a lot of reminders. I would just like be on top of them. Like, hey, it's a 10-minute, I would call break like 15 minutes before the break so that I had enough time to kind of move them towards that goal. I did at some point, like I had a French colleague teach me just one line, which was get off the stage as loud as I could, because like I'm like I really need something in my back pocket if they're not going to respect me. I'm just like, so she taught me and I yelled it. There was a group from Taiwan. The Taiwan language is very close to a dialect that I understand in Singapore, so they were very funny because they tried to switch to their language, and I just like came up behind them. I was like, I can still understand you, and no, you can't do that. And they were like,
hilarious.
so it helps to know other languages, I suppose. So Charlie Chaplin's grandson, his name is James Theory. He's quite a well-known circus performer, like circus-style performing arts. And he was so angry with me because he wanted to do something and it was meal break. I remember him shaking me on stage. Like, he just grabbed me. He was like, Audrey! And I was like, I'm sorry, you have to go off stage. It's just part of it.
So, and is Berkeley Rep also a IATSE house? You're still working on the
Berkeley Rep is not an IATSE house. Yeah, so we have AEA and SDC, which is the actors and stage management, and then we have the directors and choreographers that are all represented by a union, and the musicians, if we do a musical, are represented by AFM, but the stage technicians are not represented by IATSE. When I worked at American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco, the stage technicians are represented by local IATSE 16.
So what's the difference for those who are not familiar between an IATSE house and a non-IATSE house other than being affiliated with the union?
I think there are pros and cons to both systems, just to say it out loud. Like, I feel like what IATSE does is to protect the working class, and so I have a lot of respect for what they do. So if you're part of IATSE union, you pay dues to this union. The union can be an advocate to find you work. In a place like BAM, or across the street from BAM, there's a place called Barclays, was a huge like basketball, like performing arts, not just performing arts, but like rock and roll shows, right? So you need like 100 technicians to load in, say, Taylor Swift again. Local 16 will dispatch the technicians, right? They make sure that technicians are like trained at a certain level, they are certified, and can do the job, so that if somebody is not doing the job or is sick or needs to be replaced, like, you go back to the local union hall and they sort it out. So it's kind of like the person does the calling steward and all that. So what comes of a union contract? So union contracts are negotiated per venue a lot of times. Berkeley Rep is part of the League of Resident Theaters. So there's about 50, and it's called LORT. The League of Resident Theaters negotiates a contract together for the actors and the stage managers, directors, and choreographers. But for IATSE, IATSE unions negotiate per local and per venue, right? So as when I was part of ACT, every union contract is maybe like 3 to 5 years. You negotiate the terms. And the way the terms work is they negotiate what the wages look like depending on what level of a technician you are, what the rules are. So meal breaks are really important for them. And going over time, for example, or working on holiday, or like all the rules that kind of take care of the technicians are quite firm, right? Like, so there's no like, once you negotiate a contract, those are the rules. And then if we disagree, it gets sent up the food chain. It goes up to kind of negotiate between the director of production and the call steward. If that can't get resolved, it goes up to the general manager. If that can't get resolved, sometimes it goes to court. So court will decide who interprets, which interpretation wins. So at Berkeley Rep, we are not represented by a union. So any work group in the US, and I believe in Europe, not so much Asia. I don't know that Asia is very pro-union, but any group of people, especially in the US, are protected. So you can decide if you want to have a union come in to represent you, right? At Berkeley, when the stage technicians are not unionized, they have always the right to choose to. My philosophy is always, as an employer, if the employer does not treat their workers well, the workers always have a right to unionize, because that's kind of one strategy to protect themselves. So employers, don't let your workers down. Don't take advantage of them. Big corporations for profit. So you're seeing that right now, a historic level of groups of employees asking to unionize. And part of it is this cost of living issue that we're facing. That, I think recently Pete's Coffee in our area, REI, Pete's Coffee, a lot of places that have been very long time non-unionized have all looked for union protections. So as I'm part of management, my number one thing is if you can just stay in touch with the workforce and always take care of them and try to center them and try to listen to their needs, then there's no reason for them to have to push that need to unionize. So I think we have a lot of rules that reflect very similarly what the unions do. We follow the California work guidelines, so we don't work more than 5 hours in a row before taking a half an hour meal break. We really try to stick with them. We don't, so it's I would say it's a little bit more flexible to work in a non-union venue than to a union venue. At a union venue, it's quite strict most of the time, not all of the time. It's not, again, it's very culturally specific to each venue that you work at. And, I think that I have worked at theater companies that were not unionized, but had very strict rules. So, I mean, I feel like it's just this thing of if your management, one of the first things you do is to listen, do a listening tour, right? You don't just decide to change everything, because a big part of the listening is to see why people are upset and what change they want, or what things they think are really good that you want to keep. And I really, I feel like that's a big place, especially because in this United States model, I don't know if you've seen this sort of a Netflix documentary that the Obama Foundation made, but it's about the workforce and how it's changed. And something's changed in our history of how CEOs are getting paid 10,000 times more than the lowest paid person in the company. That never happened before. And there was a moment in time that The Economist, I can't remember what his name was, he introduced this idea that the CEO, once they became you're reporting to the stakeholders, so you need to be paid 1 billion times above everybody else. It's caused this income disparity that again, performing arts, we just mirror everything else. So that is, to me, the heart of unhappiness, of you put in so much work, you want meaning in work, but this other schmuck is getting paid so much more. It doesn't make any sense. So they really fight to get that wage level up. So I often believe that in non-for-profit theater, that income disparity cannot be that big. It shouldn't be that big. But unfortunately, in some theater companies, I know the ED, MD person gets paid a lot more than the lowest paid person. And that's a real sticking point, because a lot of us that work, do tech, do long hours loading in shows, that starts getting why am I not getting compensated enough? I'm working just as hard. I'm contributing just as much. And I can't, buy a house in the Bay Area, however it looks like. So I think that's kind of my lens of coming into this country. So Singapore is staunchly non-union. Singapore is very, very, comes from the place of there's no workers' rights. As far as I can tell, I know that a lot of NGOs trying to change that, but it's very difficult. So just kind of observing it from outside lens of is this a tool that's useful? Sometimes it's useful, and sometimes I'm not sure. So, yeah.
Well, it's such a hugely complex issue when you put it in that way, right? It's not just about making shows; it's about culture and society, and like you said, it being such a reflection of the country and culture itself. It's and then if some people are getting paid a lot more than the others, it's not that there isn't money there. It's just that the equity of where that money goes to whom is something that's really got to be looked at, right? It's got to be addressed, so that
Yeah,
the
exactly.
people. I mean, it is such a shame if people are, I don't even want to say bottom rung, but if people are working on the stage and physically doing it, they can't afford to, live a standard existence in the country that they live in without, difficulty. That's a problem. I mean, just all around, right?
Yeah, and I think the big difference, again, just to say in the American structure, is you don't have healthcare unless you have a job, a full-time job. Just to say it out loud, like that's a huge difference of having accessible healthcare. And in some countries, like in Europe, okay, fine, you don't get paid that much, but you have access to healthcare, education, and housing. Those three things are not accessible to us in the US.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a major factor. I have tried to hire people for short-term contracts well paid, but because they're in America and they can't leave their full-time job because of the health insurance, they miss out on that opportunity. It's very hard to be a freelancer in that construct in America because people want to stay close to the job that provides them insurance. And that's even though they want to come and do the gig for me in wherever in the world that we're doing it, but they can't. They don't want to give it up. And I just think that's just sad because then they're losing those opportunities.
100%. So it's
Yeah.
just that we live in this structure, and I understand why there's so much agitation right now, right? Like
Mm.
of, I mean, like even as we speak, the SAG after actors on strike and the writers on strike, right? That is kind of like what we're seeing, where people are just done with getting paid so little when you're watching again the people at the top just taking all the profits and telling a kind of a false narrative of there's no money. No, actually there is money. It's just it's not spread around. So like the actual middle working class isn't getting a fair share of that kind of income. And so
Mm.
my hope for non-for-profits in general in the US is that there is more balance. I think that actually the balance at Berkeley Rep is actually quite good right now, actually, so tax documents are all public, so you can look at it as well. But like, to me, I think do you know about the We See White American Theater document that was printed? So
Mm-hmm.
I think, even made a recommendation of 1 to 10 for the pay scale, or 1 to 8. And I feel I'm such a socialist. I'm like, no, 1 to 5. It should be 1 to 5. It can't be 1 to 10, because think about it. So I think like I wish for a moment that we could go back to the 1 to 5 model, because there's no like what is Jeff Bezos doing with all his money? Like it's just like there is enough money. It's just not spread in the right way, right? So
Mm.
yeah.
So that being said, and with all the lessons you've had, what would you say is your favorite thing about your job?
What is my favorite thing about my job? I mean, I production managed a long time. I was very lucky to fall into production management quite early in my life. So I think by 23, I was already production managing for one of the biggest theater companies in Singapore. And I think the thing about production management is just that it's never the same. And you're always having to solve something that's really fascinating and interesting. That's like a very different puzzle. So for Let the Right One In, if you've never seen it, spoiler, there is the final kind of scene where the actor looks like he's being drowned in a tank of water. And, that meant that we had to, first of all, have a special company from the UK called Water Sculptures set up the whole thing. And there's a whole filtration system that you have to get into, and like all these things, and how you heat the water. And then there's a whole component of training the performer, right? Like, so you have to use like scuba diving gear. How do you get the person to learn how to do all these things? That's just one show. But like, there are multiple shows of puzzles like that. There was a really cool show at BAM. I don't remember the name, but there was a circus company that wanted to put a net above the audience and stretch it so that the performer would jump from the balcony level and the net would kind of, go down and almost touch the audience, but it doesn't touch the audience. So we had to figure out, we had to pull a structural engineer in. We couldn't figure out what is the tension load? How do you calculate all these things? That's another kind of deep dive. So every time we do a show that has this interesting puzzle, I think that's the best part of my job of I get to talk to people that are not in the arts that do something special, like the scuba diving teacher. He was so cool. He was like, what are y'all doing? But he also did the Harry Potter show. So he was like, okay, got it. I need to teach this person this thing. But in real life, he runs a scuba diving company. Right.
Next
so
time you can call me.
I kind of like talking to people like that, so it's always kind of it's the same, but it's not. It's a little bit different. I think the other part that I like is working with really cool artists. Working with Paul Simon was just I'm standing next to Paul Simon. I've listened to your music for a lot of my life, and now I'm actually talking to you about when sound check is. That was really cool. So on days that you get to work with really brilliant artists and you see their work on stage and you see the faces of the people in the audience, and then you're like, oh, cool. I know why I'm doing this, right? That's a few moments like that. Yeah.
It's a beautiful answer. And we always ask this question, although I think you've addressed a lot of the challenges. If you could change one thing about your job or the industry, what would that be?
So much. I really think that, there's so many different things. I think the biggest thing right now is just I wish there was a way for financial stability, both for the theater companies, but also for the people that work in the arts. I wish that we as a society valued the arts a lot more than I feel like we do. And by that, I mean that we put our resources towards that. So that we as humankind recognize that art's really important in our existence, and so that we would actually put money towards that. That's a big one. I feel like things are starting to change already, and I think that with, again, the We See You White American Theater, was starting to talk about work-life balance, was starting to talk about boundaries, was starting to talk about equity, and kind of the more, I would say for me, the more painful topics of why is it in a country like America is there such a lack of diversity in so many of our fields when there's so many of us that are not just from privileged communities. I feel like that's starting to change, which is good. So, I think I wish that people got paid more, got paid fairly, and that folks that choose to have families, or folks like me who choose to have cats, that we have time to spend on those things as well, as opposed to just, hurry up, do the next thing. I think that's life. Yeah, I feel like that I wish that people could find the balance to spend time with their kids and also do really good work, because I think it's possible.
It's such a wonderful answer, and I'm 100% behind you on all of those fronts. I'm with you. Audrey, it's been such a pleasure to meet you today and speak with you. Thank you so much for joining the podcast today. Thank you for having me. It's so nice to see you both. Yeah. Have a wonderful August. You have a wonderful day.